Thank you all for coming. And I would like to start with a prayer in gratitude for the experience of this trip and the chance to be here together and to share and to learn from one another as I learned from all of the people I encountered. So a few quick housekeeping kinds of notes as you see in the slides. I was in Arizona and Mexico with the Kino Border Initiative, Catholic Sisters Walking with Migrants. Kino is a Jesuit-sponsored binational ministry that promotes migration with dignity. Catholic Sisters Walking with Migrants has, for the past several years, consisted of a month-long immersion at Kino. This was the first week-long immersion program, and it was amazing to take part in. The Hilton Foundation also funded the program, so I feel like I should give a shout out to the Hilton Foundation. The program has three main goals: to humanize the people who are involved in the migration process on both sides, to accompany primarily the migrants, and to complicate. Hopefully what I present today will demonstrate that they succeeded in all three goals. I was in Arizona and Mexico from the 24th to the 31st of January, and there is no way I could talk about all of the people that I encountered along the way. So I'm going to choose a few experiences and a few people that we met that I hope encapsulate what we learned. And we are the group that you see on the right here. There were 11 of us from about 9 different communities. We ranged in age from 84 to somewhere in their 30s. And it was a diverse group of sisters, which was great because I learned a lot from them as well. This is also my third trip to the border. I've been twice with Sheil, and so the trip, I will admit, is somewhat different when you're not chaperoning students. And I feel that the experiences have been cumulative. The more time I spend at the border, the more I recognize how very little I understand of what is going on at the border and in our immigration system. Please do feel free to ask questions throughout. There's a microphone up here because the people online cannot hear without the microphone. So if you have a question, come up and grab the microphone, or maybe Jenna or Judy will be willing to pass it around. I cannot promise I'll have answers, but I will do my best. And folks online, if you want to type questions into the chat, I'm sure Sister Susan will pass them on. I also apologize now if I get choked up during the presentation. It was an emotionally difficult week, and I'm still sitting in and working through those emotions, and they may come out tonight. I have tissues in my pocket, and I'll do my best to keep on going in spite of any emotional issues. So Suze, if I can have the next slide. Should be able to just write. As do we all. I apologize for one more thing. I do not speak Spanish, and there are several moments where Spanish names occur, so I apologize for those of you who do speak Spanish. It will not be pretty. But Ambos Nogales means both Nogales. Nogales is a city that just happens to be split by an international border. We were brought to the location of this photograph the evening after we landed in Tucson, and it seemed fitting to both start the trip here and start this talk here. The wall makes it clear how deep and how clear that split is and how it runs right down the center of the city. Note particularly the concertina wire on our side of the fence, on the US side of the fence. Shortly, I'll show the photos of the wall from the Mexican side, and it looks wildly different from that side. Next slide, Suze. I would love to be able to say that the stories that get told about the wall and what separates us and what unites us differ by which side of the wall you're standing on. Sadly, that is not the case. It seems as though every story told about the wall and about the border has multiple sides to it, and they're all complicated and multifaceted. Despite the wall, there is an odd unity to the city of Nogales. Even now, there is quite a lot of back and forth. The store in the image on the right is about a block away from the wall on the Arizona side in a district that is within a few blocks of 2 of the 3 gates or border crossings in Nogales. It is primarily a shopping and arts district. I thought about cropping this so just the fresco was visible, but I realized I wanted to include the store too. It's not a great photo, so I'll tell you that it's a clothing store. There are about 20,000 people living in Nogales, Arizona, and about 300,000 in Nogales, Sonora. Even after the construction of the wall, the city is deeply entwined in many ways. According to the Santa Cruz County website, an estimated 60% of sales tax revenue in Arizona comes from the 50,000 shoppers from Mexico who cross the border daily. Judy, did you have a question? Population, 20,000 in Arizona, 20,000 and 300,000 in Sonora. In taking the photo on the right, I'm standing in front of a tactical shop, and right next door is a charter school. It's Arizona, so having a gun store right next to a school does not seem to read as an issue, although it did strike me as very odd. The charter school is not supposed to enroll students from Mexico, but apparently that is enforced relatively loosely. The fresco is by Carlos Ibarra, with thanks to Susan Clark for researching this. It pays homage to Ambos Nogales, both sides of the city, not in this vision divided by a wall, but united by a beating heart, and what is almost certainly the tree of life, and by some industry, the cogs in the tree. The border vidette, the words you can see very faintly running across the top of the fresco, was the newspaper in the late 19th century when the wall or the border might have been simple as a barbed wire fence, but in the city might not have even been that much. It might not have been marked at all. I'm going to point to a couple of things. There is a church on the left side of the image. So the church is here, and there is a courthouse on the right side. It's got a funny dome. There, those buildings, you'll see them again in actual real life. Okay, well, I'll try to stand closer to the mic. Okay. Can I have the next slide, Suze? This is a photo of much the same scene from the Historical Society in downtown Nogales. If you click away from Zoom and onto the screen, it should click there and then hit return. So this is a photo of much the same scene from the Historical Society. A group of us had gone to downtown Nogales on a free afternoon, and we walked into the Historical Society 6 minutes before it closed, which is not a great move, but the women who were running it were so excited to have 6 strangers walk in to the Historical Society that they kept it open for nearly half an hour after closing. So we spent quite a lot of time there. But again, you can see how well united this city is. There is, like, I couldn't tell you where the border is. The only landmark I have is that church from Mexico, La Parroquia de la Purísima Concepción, the church at the left-hand side of the fresco, and it's here in the photo. The courthouse, which is not in this photo, was built in 1903. So this was built somewhere between the founding of the church in 1891 and the courthouse, building of the courthouse in 1903. There is still a railway crossing here. You can see kind of the railroad at the bottom. And this is the only international railway crossing in Arizona. So you'll hear sometimes in stories about migration about La Bestia. This is the beast. Suze, the next slide, please. Kathleen? Left is Mexico and right is Arizona. Yes. There's train going right through. Yes. As I say, the train still goes right through, but it's a lot more complex now. Okay, Suze, next slide. We had already been in Mexico. We went to Mexico on Monday. We arrived on Saturday. We went to Mexico by Monday, but I became much, much more aware of the omnipresence of the wall on Wednesday morning when a few of us walked up the hill next to our house to watch the sunrise. There in the distance, cutting across the landscape, is the wall. It is really implicated in all the life of all of the people in the city. Next slide, please. The wall is much less same sunrise, a little bit later. The wall is much less visible here. And you can see that it's just kind of plunked down in the middle of the city. There are just houses on either side. The courthouse that I mentioned earlier is pretty much right in the middle of that photograph. It's not very visible. My photographs were not the best, and we shared them. I was too distracted by what we were doing to take good photos, so I apologize for that. Next slide, Suze. We crossed the border to work at Kino on Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. There is a Kino office on the United States side, but we only went in there when we landed at Tucson, the day we landed, and then there was one day when construction on the Mexican building made it really hard to hear each other, and we needed to sit down and talk to each other, and so we crossed over and went back to Arizona. So we crossed the border first on Monday. And as I mentioned, there are 3 gates, and at various points we used all 3 of them. There was also actually a cattle crossing gate, but we didn't use that one. But for some reason, I did take a photo of it. So that is what you see here, the thing that looks like telephone poles in the background. So we're on the Mexican side of the border, and there is like a cattle pen, maybe half a mile down the road. And the cattle apparently have passports. So like they have identification cards with the markings and the brands and all of that, so that the fake cattle don't get a crow. I don't even know, but so that the people the cattle I assume it's also partly a health thing. The cattle that the rancher says are his and that have been demonstrated as healthy are the only cattle that can get across. We spent Sunday afternoon with a rancher, and he talked a little bit about this. Next slide, please, Suze. My photos from the other gates, the other crossings, are somewhat even less spectacular than that. This is partly because at most of the gates, there are signs indicating that cameras and cell phones are not permitted. I'm a rule follower, and so I didn't take photos, but not all of the sisters I was with are, so I do have some photos. And to be honest, we stood outside Mexican customs taking photos, and not a single person seemed to care. So, it's very casual, no photos or no cameras. This is the main gate. All three of these photos kind of point to the main gate that we used, the Mariposa Gate, and we used it mainly because Kino is a few blocks from it. It's primarily a vehicle gate. It's the only gate through which commercial vehicles can pass, and it's open from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. As you can see, it's in a commercial area. There are a lot of warehouses, and the parking lot where we parked may or may not have been a taxi stand. Every day we were supposed to take a $5 bill and fold it up, and we were supposed to have it stick out of our gas cap. We couldn't figure out how to do that, so we just put it under our windshield, and then we had to text this number, and the guy would say, okay, and so we would go over, and one day he didn't come to pick it up, and it really wasn't clear to me that he actually owned the property and that we were paying for it. There were no gates. It was very strange. But it worked, and our car was never broken into or stolen. So, and $5, $15 to park for 3 days seems very reasonable to me. The central photo is us on the way into Mexico. It was about a mile between the dubious taxi stand where we parked to Kino, and it mostly looked like this. As we got closer to the Mexican border, there was a metal fence on our left side, as well as this fence on our right that was made out of mostly repurposed asphalt. About once every time we crossed at this gate, we run into another couple of people trying to cross there, but mostly we did not see other pedestrians. This is not a heavily pedestrian gate. It felt very claustrophobic. It did not feel welcoming. But going through Mexican customs was incredibly anticlimactic. We walked all this way. We went through a couple of revolving doors, or those like revolving gates that you see on outdoors. And we went into the Mexican Border Patrol station, and there was a metal detector and an X-ray machine. There were never any people inside of this building. So the first time we crossed, I was at the head of the line, and I set off the metal detector. I couldn't put my bag through the X-ray machine because it wasn't turned on. So the metal detector starts beeping loudly, and I stopped. But there was no one there to do anything. Like no one was going to say, go through or stop or I need to search your bag. There was no one in the building except the rest of us. So the Kino guide told me to go, and I dutifully went. And that happened every time we went through Mexican immigration. We just would cross through, set off the metal detector, and walk away. As one of the sisters later observed, we could have been smuggling guns in every time we crossed. We weren't, but we could have, and no one looked. Coming back into the US entailed a similar length walk. This one was even stranger though, and you can see a picture on the right. We took less photos here because the United States Border Patrol and Guard, the customs folks, were a little bit more strict. So when we first approached the border, we all had to go through a revolving door in front of which there were 2 border protection and customs agents, and we all had to show them that we had passports or passport cards. Notice that I did not say we had to show them our passports. We just had to show them that we had them, that we had US passports. I presume if we had not, we would have had to show them visas or something. It would have been a little bit more complex. But that was the US border. And if anyone sets foot on US soil, they have the right to request asylum. And since the asylum process in the United States is currently shut down by presidential order, they are doing their best to keep people out so that they cannot request asylum. So that was the job of these 2 people standing at the gate. So we flashed our passports and walked on along another path. And as you can see, this one was grassy and looked like a park. And it's that weird no man's land between the border and customs. And there's a bunch of strange artwork. So the building that customs is in has footprints all over it. Of different sizes, and I assume it's supposed to indicate like motion and migration, but they're like climbing up the side of the building. It was very strange. But we can't take photos of it because no photos were allowed. The first time we crossed, there was a bus crossing at the same time, and all of the passengers get off the bus, and they so the X-ray machine was on, and we had to stand in line for a little bit, although the pedestrian line was much shorter. But our bags were X-rayed. They look at your passport, they take a photo, they ask what you're doing in Mexico, you say volunteering, they wave you through. The first time we did this, our Kino guide asked us to try to remember the name of the customs agent to whom we spoke. And I found that 5 minutes later, when we got through customs and regrouped outside of the building, that I could not. His point was that when we're confronted with authorities in uniforms, sometimes we don't pay attention to them as people, and sometimes we're so nervous that we don't remember. And of course, we all speak the language. We weren't trying to hide anything. When folks have complaints about being mistreated by border guards, which is something that Kino handles regularly, it's even harder for them to remember the names of the people who mishandled them. So we all crossed through every single time with very little issue. The last time we crossed, one of the sisters had an apple in her backpack, and that was confiscated. But that was like the biggest issue that we had. Even though we were all traveling on US passports, we actually did have a few sisters with us who had emigrated to the United States. We had a sister from the Philippines and a sister from Vietnam, as well as a sister from Mexico, from Colombia, and from the Dominican Republic. The two sisters from Asia had fairly strong accents, but all of the native Spanish speakers also spoke English fluently, and two of them were in habit, which probably did not hurt that situation. So the process was easy and smooth. In years past, when I've crossed with students, we've had one student traveling on a visa from Singapore, and she was questioned quite extensively. And some of the students of Mexican descent were also questioned with a little bit more pressure. And I don't know if you all experienced that. My sense is that you did experience that. I'm getting nods. That some of the students who went down this past December were also had issues. So the next slide. These are photos of the DiConcini gate, which is both vehicles, private vehicles, and a pedestrian gate. The one on the left is both of them are taken from the Mexican side. I'm on an overpass above the street. And the one on the left, I'm at the south. You can see the railroad tracks on the left, and you can see how wildly backed up the traffic is. There's frequently a 2-hour wait at this gate to get through from Mexico to the United States. The lane on the left is the Century Pass, the people who have paid money to get through quickly, and the lane on the right is like a turnaround for traffic into the city, and even that backed up. On the right is looking north into the United States, so you can actually see the gate there. Next slide, Suze, please. And because I promised it would come up again, this is La Parroquia de la Purísima Concepción, the parish in Nogales. It's about a 2 or 3 block walk from the bridge where we were standing in the last slide. So it's about 2 blocks from the gate. It is also one of the places that Kino Border Initiative traces its roots to. When migrants first began to be returned to Mexico, they were dropped off at the DiConcini gate. They still are today. And the church is visible from there, so people just walked to it, hoping they could find somebody to help. Because the drop-offs often happened late at night, they still happen late at night, the church began leaving its doors open. So the services that Kino provides grew out of the services that were provided by this church. Next slide, please. More photos of the DeConcini gate, the pedestrian part of the gate. There's an arcade of shops. And here we are. This photo on the bottom right is us waiting to go through customs at about 8 o'clock on Friday night. There was actually about a 40-minute wait because everybody was going across to the United States. Well, not everybody. About half the population was also going over to Mexico. It's a busy time. So this was virtually the only time we had a significant wait time. Morley Gate is a pedestrian-only gate, and I don't have a photo of it. We used it only once, Friday night, on our way over into Mexico, and I honestly could not tell you when we went through the gate. We were late, and so we were trying to keep up with a younger sister who was leading us, like taking us to dinner, and we were all running, and it was upstairs and downstairs and through hallways and over the railroad tracks and through whatever, and suddenly I realized we were in Mexico. And then the height of privilege to not even recognize when you have crossed an international border didn't kind of stand out to me for a couple of hours afterwards. And then I was like, wait a minute, like we just crossed a border and I didn't even notice, and I could do that. Next slide, Suze. On most highways, there are also Border Patrol checkpoints about 30 miles past the border. So this one is on the highway between Nogales and Tucson. Again, we had little to no trouble passing them. The last night, when a group of us were being driven to Tucson for our early Saturday departures, we had barely pulled up to the checkpoint. We were in a white rental van, and the Customs and Border Protection agent said, "Church group?" And our driver, who was not in habit, in no way visibly marked as a nun, said church group. She hadn't really gotten her window rolled all the way down. It was the end of a long week. We found this hysterically funny. They could probably hear us laughing. And it's funny, and it's not funny. They just waved us through without really even looking at us. This was on a Friday evening. The Tuesday before, while we had been visiting the federal court in Tucson, a man was shot by Border Patrol at a checkpoint much like this. He was in the town of Arivaca, where we had been on Sunday, and the checkpoint had not even been staffed at that point, but this man was shot. As I said, he was, and I'll talk about Border Patrol later, but we were told by Border Patrol that he was a known smuggler, which probably means smuggler of people. It might mean smuggler of drugs, but it's probably people. And that he shot first. And he is still alive. But for what for us is relatively painless, for other people is deadly at some times. And these checkpoints, of course, exist for the purpose of making sure that people who have gotten into the United States without what is considered appropriate documentation don't get too far into the United States without getting caught, or they have to go around these checkpoints, which means going out into the desert. Next slide, please. So, why am I talking so much about gates and crossings and the checkpoints, which, as I say, were incredibly uneventful for us? It's because of the recognition that what was for us mostly a long, somewhat tedious walk, or a boring wait in line, or even a funny moment, is for others fraught with difficulty, confusion, and even danger. The wall, the gates, and the checkpoints are to a large extent a form of theater. They exist to serve a purpose, certainly, but they also exist in the form that they currently take in order to tell a story. And that story is clear to almost everybody who encounters them. It's a story about the power of the United States and the lack of power of the individuals who want to be here. Even as citizens, and wildly privileged citizens at that, we had almost no power at the border. Even more pointedly, it is about the power differential between Mexico and the United States. Both the state of Mexico and the citizens of Mexico and everyone who comes through Mexico trying to get to the United States. The gates and the walls in their current state began around 1994 when a policy known as prevention through deterrence was implemented. The goals of this plan, as stated by Border Patrol, were not only to slow the number of migrants crossing the southern border, but to promote confidence in the United States' abilities to protect that border. Who was president in 1994? It was Bill Clinton. So neither party has cornered the market on immigration policies that pose a danger to migrants, because as we know, prevention through deterrence did not work. Clinton had these walls constructed, the large infrastructure. He increased Border Patrol in cities and towns throughout Arizona and Texas and California. And the logic was, if we make it difficult to cross at borders, at crossing points, nobody would be foolhardy enough to go out into the desert to cross. Nobody's going to do that. It's too dangerous. And of course, we know that they were wrong. If I had time, I would talk about our desert hike. I would talk about looking at the possessions that the migrants brought with them and abandoned in the desert. I would talk about our visit to the Fiduciary Cemetery in Tucson, where all of the remains that have been found in the desert, whether they have been identified or not, are buried. But there's only so much I can fit into an hour, so I will leave that for another time. Next slide, please. This is the Mexican side of the wall. No concertina wire and quite a lot of artwork. We visited this area of Nogales on Monday after serving breakfast at Kino, and the contrast is just remarkable. One of the instructions, though, that we received before we left for this walk was that if we saw someone trying to climb over the wall, we should give them space and walk away. I can only imagine that that has happened before on a Kino trip, and that's why we give us this warning, but I cannot imagine trying to climb this wall. Even if it were not so daunting, it's in a residential neighborhood on both sides of the wall. I don't know how you would think that you wouldn't get caught if you were climbing over. I mean, there were people everywhere. So as I say, the wall looks dramatically different. There's formal artwork and informal artwork, and there was no concertina wire. I don't know if the implication of that is that nobody's going to try to climb into Mexico, or whether it's an attempt to kind of soften the psychological impact of the wall. Right, there's no wire. The wire is only on the United States side. Right, there's none right in this space here. There's none right on this part of the wall here, but we saw none at all in Mexico, and it wasn't uncommon in the United States. Yeah, sorry. So there's formal artwork that our Kino guide is standing in front of, and it captures the migrant experience of what they carry with them. So one guy has a washing machine on him, on his back, and they're going in both directions, which I find fascinating. This American flag is kind of midway between formal and informal artwork. Some of the handprints on the right that says La Libertad, so they make statements about various things. Some of the graffiti also contains statements about La Migra, the Border Patrol, but I cannot repeat those in mixed company, and I didn't take photos of that. I'm sure you can all imagine what they said. So next slide, please. Kathleen, was that a question? That is the one who lost his life. Yes, so this photo is not just about the serpent decorating the wall above the image. It's mainly about the image of the boy below the wall. This is Jose Antonio Rodriguez. Jose was 16 years old on October 10th, 2012, when he was shot 10 times and killed by a US Border Patrol agent shooting through the fence. It was a Friday evening, and Jose had gone out to hang out with his friends, and then he was going to meet his brother for a snack. This is the residential neighborhood that I mentioned earlier. So According to Border Patrol, a group of boys, of which presumably Jose was part, had gathered collected a basket of stones and were throwing them at the agents who feared for their lives, and so responded by shooting through the fence somewhere between 14 and 30 times. You can still see the pockmarks of the bullets in the building, like you can see a shadow of a building where we're standing on the sidewalk. You can still see the pockmarks, but there was no way to photograph those. These cars are immensely helpful for scale. Ask yourself, could you throw a rock with sufficient force over or through that wall to lead somebody to legitimately fear for their lives? The base of the wall, I mean, the cars are there, is about 20 feet above the street level, and the wall is between 17 and 20 feet tall. Do you know anybody who could throw a rock that far, that hard, that you couldn't simply step back 10 feet and not get hit by it? I've actually asked some of the Shields students whether they could throw a rock, because I'm a middle-aged nun. I know I cannot throw a rock that far, but maybe somebody else could. Maybe a 16-year-old could. None of them, no one has said they could throw a rock that far. Those are homes on the other side of the fence, yes. And I'm currently standing in Mexico for this photo. Agent Lonnie Swartz was indicted in 2015 for second-degree murder. The delay was partly because legal arguments were made as to whether Jose Antonio deserved constitutional rights as a citizen of another country. It was ruled that Agent Swartz was standing on US soil when he fired his gun and killed Jose, so he was subject to US laws, even if Jose was not afforded the protection of the US Constitution. And part of that lack of protection meant that none of the witnesses from Mexico, his friends, the brother he was going to meet, were given visas to testify in court in the United States against the agent who shot him. So the US Border Patrol's version of events went largely unchallenged. Ultimately, Lonnie Swartz was found not guilty of involuntary manslaughter. Interestingly, the jury deadlocked on the higher charge of manslaughter, but the judge ruled that since he had been found not guilty of the lesser charge, he could not be retried on the greater charge. So he is not guilty. This is, of course, the expected and familiar narrative of the border for many of us. Border Patrol agents are against the immigrants, or even just anti-Mexico, and use far too much force, or use force inappropriately. Jose Antonio wasn't even a migrant. He was not trying to cross the border. He was simply a citizen of another country, and he is not afforded basic human rights. It makes us angry, it makes us sad, but it also feels vaguely comfortable, if we're honest, because it is the story that most of us, so many of us, expect. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for me, the Kino goals of humanizing and complicating reared their ugly heads a few days later when we spent 2 hours at the Nogales Border Patrol station. The stumbling blocks in the narrative of Border Patrol bad, Mexicans and immigrants good, were Carlo and Ariel, the two guys who led us on the tour and who are photographed here. And I asked them for permission to photograph them and to use their real names, and they are fine with it. Carlo and Ariel are both sons of Mexican immigrants, both former active duty military, and they knew that we were all nuns, so they made a point of letting us know that they are both practicing Catholics. And the narrative that they told framed them, and indeed all of Border Patrol, as the good guys. I wish I'd taken a photo of it, but the lobby of the Nogales Border Patrol station, so when you walk in and sign in, there are 4 huge framed images and stories of the Border Patrol agents killed in the line of duty since the founding of the Nogales Border Patrol station in 1924. In case we think that things are getting more dangerous, the first 2 were killed during Prohibition. So quite a while ago. Carlo and Ariel's narrative focused on Border Patrol as enforcing the laws, and they clearly see law enforcement as bringing about justice. Immigrants who cross without papers are jumping the line, and they should do things the right way, the way their families, their fathers did when they immigrated. We did not try to challenge them with the idea that there could possibly be more than one pathway to citizenship. This whole experience was deeply strange because we're talking to these people and they're framing themselves as good guys, and they are good guys, they're not bad men. I would trust either of them to help me with anything. But the story they told was very strange. They framed many immigrants as dangerous drug smugglers. A lot of the images they showed us included large amounts of drugs being smuggled in backpacks, in cars, through tunnels, all kinds of different ways. On our way to the station, one of the sisters had announced that she was going to press them on the shooting that had happened the day before. I mentioned it earlier. They were, of course, prepared and pointed out that he was a known smuggler and that he had shot first. The case in front of which we're standing in this photo includes the story of Brian Terry, a Border Patrol agent who was killed in the line of duty in 2010. So he's one of those four guys. The gun that killed Brian Terry was traced back to what is known as Operation Fast and Furious, in which US federal agents allowed criminals to buy firearms with the intention of tracking them back to criminal organizations. But the US Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosive lost track of most of the guns almost instantly, including 2 found at the scene of Terry's death. Mexico, it turns out, has much stricter gun laws certainly than Arizona, and in fact than most of the United States. In 2024, according to one study, nearly 78% of the guns seized in Mexico were smuggled in from the US. Hence the sister's remark about we could have been smuggling guns in every day. In response to questions about gun smuggling, Carlo and Ariel spoke about the need to beef up programs like DARE in the US to remove the market for drugs in states, the need for parents to be involved and raise their children right. We also, in the course of this visit, spent time in the old area where immigrants detained. They have built a new area in the past 2 years, and we were not allowed there for reasons that should be obvious, but apparently there are not very many people there right now. By that point, we were also overwhelmed. It didn't occur to us to take photos, but a room, say the size of where those choir stalls was said to be able to house 32 men, and I'm not sure how they could do that. In response to questions about family separation and immigrant detention, they pointed out that the Border Patrol was simply following the law. They noted that most migrants knew that they should claim that they had a credible fear of violence if they were returned to their home country. One of the first questions that you ask in an interview to see whether somebody might be eligible for asylum is known as the credible threat. Is there the credible threat interview? If there is a credible threat, you're allowed to get in line for an asylum. They also claimed that kids cried when they were taken away from detention, which I found somewhat dubious. It's possible 1 or 2 did, but my guess is that most did not. One particular story that Carlo told was about a child of about 7 years old who had been crossing alone or without her parents. And he called, she had a phone number written in the palm of her hand, and so he called Phoenix to reunite this child with her mother. When he called, he heard the voice of children that he assumed to be the mother's children in the background, and he said it made him angry. What kind of mother leaves their child alone in Mexico? She'd been living with her grandparents, and goes off to the United States alone and then has more children. And he didn't seem to be able to consider what kinds of extreme poverty or danger might lead a mother to consider doing that. They framed current practices of no asylum as following the law. They claimed incorrectly that asylum claims can be only made from a country whose border touches our own. So they say that Mexicans would be the only people who are allowed to claim asylum in the United States. That is patently untrue. And I don't think they thought they were lying. I think they thought that that was what they had been told at some point. Probably, at least partly, because one of our group was suffering from dehydration and spent the morning in their quiet room, they did talk a fair amount about the mental health training that they had begun to receive in the past several years. They note that it gives them an opportunity to clear their minds and go home to their families without bringing the stress and trauma of work home. I didn't think to ask at the time whether they thought that being mindful and being able to de-escalate situations at work also might be useful, and I kind of wish I had thought that. We ended the tour at the Horse Patrol barn. Apparently Horse Patrol is still a thing in Nogales Border Patrol, and that was almost certainly purposeful. Seeing the horses and hearing about how they are taken care of, even after they're no longer able to be in active service. Ariel had adopted one of the horses that was too old to work, and so he talked about that. It was the kind of thing that can make a lot of people consider joining the Border Patrol. It looked like fun. And because I was also thinking about future Shield Center trips to the border, at the end of the trip, I asked Carlo for a card. We had to go back into the building to get it, and he saw the medal around my neck. And he told me that he wears a Benedictine medal pinned to his vest, to his Kevlar vest. And he asked me specifically for prayers, which of course I said yes. Ariel was apparently making the same request to the other sisters as they all headed to the van. As I say, we did question some of the strands in their narratives, but it is clear that these two men think of themselves as good guys, and I would be hard-pressed to describe them otherwise. It's hard to reconcile them and their narrative with a lot of the rest of what we saw on the border. Sorry, Suze, can you go to the next slide? It is a terrible picture of the group of us at the horse barn, but there we are. So now I'll ask you to go to the next slide, Suze. This is an image on the wall of the Comedor at Kino Border Initiative, where we served breakfast, lunch, and lunch on Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. You'll note that I don't have photos of the migrants that we spent time with while we were there. They are so vulnerable, and the power differential between us and them is so great that we tried to respect them by not photographing them or using their photos in public talks, nor will I use their real names. But we did meet migrants. After serving breakfast the first time, we were told to go sit and talk to them. My first reaction, beyond I am not good at sitting and talking to strangers, was, I don't speak Spanish. What am I supposed to do here? That turned out to be far less of a problem than I would have thought. I sat down with Diego, not his real name, to discover that he had lived in Seattle for 22 years. He has a US citizen wife and 2 children, aged 15 and 3. His mother still lives in Chiapas, in the far south of Mexico, but he doesn't really know anyone else in Mexico. He's been in Nogales for a couple of months and is working on getting a job, but he admits quite freely that he plans to cross again to the United States as soon as possible. He says it might be 3 years, but he feels like he can wait. At breakfast on Wednesday, I spoke with Raul, again, not his real name, who spoke far less English, but he's lived in the United States, in Salt Lake City, for most of his life. He knows almost no one in Nogales and has no family or friends in Mexico. He's been in Nogales for 3 months and he has a job, but he was so lonely that even the conversation that we had, half in English, about a quarter in Spanish and the rest in like gestures and goodwill and like a lot of kind of talking around people or asking other people, he had tears in his eyes when he was done talking to me. And upon hearing that we were going to serve lunch again, he said he was going to come back. And it seemed as though it was just he needed somebody to talk to because he was so lonely. I also met Anton, who has lived in the United States for 33 years and recently started a nursery plants, not children, I asked, in his in-laws' backyard. His in-laws are running the nursery now because his wife is too scared to leave the house and scared to let their 4 children out of the house. I spoke with men who had lived in Chicago or Indianapolis, with one man who had to relearn Spanish when he was deported because he hadn't spoken it for 20 years. Many of the men whom Kino serves currently, and it does serve men mostly at the moment, have been working and raising families and living lives in the US before the recent waves of deportations began. Many of these men do not seem to have been picked up near the border, but from the interior of the US and then self-deported to the border. There was almost no northward movement toward the United States. Refugee visas are not currently being processed, and so people are simply not coming up. In years past, when I've been on the border, there are people who come up to the border and find themselves kind of stalled at the border while they figure out how to cross, and Kino has in the past served many of those people. There was almost nobody in that process. Maybe one of the 2 of you who were in Mexico in December can talk about whether there were people at the place, Casa de Esperanza. So what Cam was saying, they are pretty much stalled there. There are families there who are waiting for asylum, but they've been there for about 9 months with no real hope of moving. So next slide. So since I've gotten back, I've spent a lot of time reflecting on this experience. Sometimes the border seems really far away. And then I remember Frank, who lived in Chicago for nearly as long as I have, and who's picked up by ICE. What happens on the border affects all of us. One of the issues that complicates the situation at the border and in places like Chicago is that the policies that are currently in place have not changed all that much for the past 30 years. It's the practices by which those policies are implemented that change wildly. Sometimes it seems like nearly daily. And it's hard to keep up, and it's hard to know what to do. I do not have any answers. I do suspect that demonizing any of the people involved in the immigration question does not contribute to the answer. Setting up any system as us versus them is not going to help us move forward. I had gone into this trip thinking that I knew who the good guys were and who the bad guys were, expecting that I would add to the list of people I regularly hold in prayer: Raul, Diego, Anton, Frank, migrants, and the folks who work with them, particularly the folks at Kino. And I certainly do pray for those folks. I did not expect to get prayer requests from people like federal criminal court judge Eric Markowitz, who spent an hour with us after we spent the morning in court, witnessing to immigration-related criminal cases, or Border Patrol agents Ariel and Carlo, or the owners of a cattle ranch on the border who are firmly set against immigration. But now I pray for them all as well. And my hope is that all of us are changed by prayer so that we can all work together to address this problem that is the border. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions. Okay. Oh. That is a wall at Kino Border Initiative. So it's like I'm standing on the balcony, and it's like right where the folks go up. There's a shelter there where they go up to the shelter. One of the sisters said at one point, "Well, what's the star?" And I thought, well, it's the North Star, of course. So it's... Thank you. Thank you all. Oh, no more deaths. Yes, so no more deaths. No Mas Muertos is an organization based primarily in the United States. They deliver water to stations in the desert. Just leave water behind, so that immigrants who are crossing through the desert have access to water. There are other organizations that do that. We did a water drop. I think you all did a water drop too, with Ajo Samaritans. But No More Deaths is one of the groups that does that kind of work. They also have a fabulous website. Fabulous is maybe not a great word, but that has, like, you can track where migrants have been found in the desert. So they have like GPS coordinates for every migrant that has been found in the desert. I don't know Jason Patrick DeLeon. So, okay. Wonderful. Kate, can you tell us something about Jason Patrick DeLeon? Kate, we're going to unmute you, and then if you can talk, that'd be great. Yes, that's.
Hi, Belinda. Jason De Leon is an anthropologist who's been doing a lot of this work on the border and brings forensic anthropology methods to identifying migrants' camps. He's worked to create art exhibits of things left behind. Just really extensive work. He had a MacArthur recently, and he's written several books. Takes an
Wonderful.
anthropological approach, so I thought you'd like to hear about him.
Yes, yeah, thank you. One of the folks we spoke to at Kino also was a guy named Tobin Hansen, who now has a repository of objects that have been left behind in the desert, and he's trying to return them to the people who left them behind. Things like water bottles and stuff can't be returned, but photos or Bibles or things that have personal significance, Tobin is working to return them to the folks, survivors in Mexico, family members in Mexico.
It's really something to see the shoes with the carpet on the bottom.
Yes, yeah. So when migrants go into the desert, they put like sheepskin or carpets on the bottom so that the footprints can't be, the Border Patrol can't track the footprints or the direction that they're heading. So. Well, thank you all very much for coming out.